The theme for this year's monster movie reviews is creature features, and now that I've covered two sort of defining examples of the genre, at least how I see it, in It Came From Outer Space and Them, I want to talk about the movie that may have been more responsible than any other individual film for kicking off the creature feature craze that I'm talking about all this week. These giant mutant monster movies, these science fiction horror films from the 1950s. The movie that may have kicked off the craze more than any single film is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. This film was released on June 13, 1953. It was directed by Eugene Laurier. It was his directorial debut, although he had previously worked as a production designer for the great filmmaker Jean Renoir on his great classic films Grand Illusion and Rules of the Game, among others. And then after The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, he went on to direct several other monster movies of this same type, including Gorgo, which is a really fun movie if you haven't seen that one. It was produced by Hal E. Chester, who previously was a producer for a long-running series of low-budget Joe Palooka films, and Jack Dietz. The screenplay, this might be a familiar name to some of you, was by Fred Freiberger, who had a very long career as a writer for TV and film, and he's probably most famous, or to some infamous, as the producer for the very poorly regarded third and final season of the original Star Trek, and also for Space 1999. Those sort of hurt his reputation among certain science fiction fans, although personally I think Fred gets a bad rap. I think in both of those situations he was handed a pretty shitty hand, and he just tried to do the best with the cards he was dealt. But he was the writer for Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It was based on a short story by Ray Bradbury, titled The Foghorn originally. And one of the most notable things about this movie, and to me the key to its success, both creatively and commercially, this was the first movie where the great Ray Harryhausen had complete control over the stop-motion effects. He wasn't just working as an animator, he was the boss of the stop-motion animation. And the Beast itself in this film is a product of Ray Harryhausen's beautiful, intricate, ingenious stop-motion animation technique, and it benefits this film in just incredibly profound ways. The cast, first there's Paul Christian, aka Paul Hubschmid. He was a Swiss actor who had a very long career in the entertainment industry in Germany. He made a handful of Hollywood films, including this one, which was probably his most high-profile role. Paula Raymond, who worked extensively in television and in low-budget movies throughout the 1950s, all the way through the 1990s. Cecil Kellaway, an extremely prolific character actor. He also appeared in horror films like The Invisible Man Returns and The Mummy's Hand. And it also stars, in an early role, Lee Van Cleef, who has a small role in this film, a pivotal role, but a small role, who would go on after this to eventually become one of the great villains in cinema history. He played bad guys in numerous westerns, notably spaghetti westerns in the 60s and 70s, just one of the great legendary faces in the history of cinema. You can catch him in this movie, the great Lee Van Cleef. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, like the other creature features that I have discussed and will discuss throughout the week in this series, deals with themes of human arrogance, of human short-sightedness, of humans pursuing science, pursuing advancement, and then suffering from unforeseen consequences. That's a major theme in this movie. The limits of man's knowledge and what happens when we outrun our knowledge, when our reach exceeds our grasp. That is a theme in this movie. Atomic paranoia, which we also saw in Them, and which will pop up again. But unlike Them, and even It Came From Outer Space, which definitely had some moral elements to it, had elements of sort of a parable to it, unlike those movies, this movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, isn't really terribly interested in the themes. They are definitely there, and you can definitely read these themes into the movie, and you can see that it is sort of addressing these questions and raising these issues, but it's driven much more by its plot and especially by those amazing Ray Harryhausen special effects. It's not nearly as interested in sending a message to the audience, or in making some kind of a social or political commentary or statement. And that makes it seem a little flatter than them, especially, which I think is still my favorite of the creature features. It doesn't quite come across as strongly or as memorably as them, even though it really surpasses it on the technical level. Again, I can't stress enough how amazing the stop motion effects are. It's some of Harryhausen's most beautiful work, and that really carries the movie, even though the movie itself kind of falls flat in terms of story and in terms of emotion and content and having something to say. It is carried along by those Harryhausen special effects, because the beast itself is really a sight to behold. This was actually the first major giant dinosaur film, at least of its era. There were dinosaur films in the silent era, and of course there's that famous appearance of dinosaurs in the original King Kong. But in terms of 1950s horror movies and sci-fi movies, this was the first big giant dinosaur movie. This actually came out over a year before the first Godzilla movie opened in Japan. So there was the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms as a stop-motion creation before there was Godzilla as the unforgettable guy in the suit stomping through model cities. It does take a bit to get going. As I said, it's very focused on its plot. It's not so focused on its characters or the meaning of it all. And there are times, especially when they're not dealing directly with the beast itself, when the movie really drags. It takes a long time to get going, and there are stretches in the middle where it feels like all the characters are doing are just going to meet new characters and trying to convince them that the beast is real and that they have to do something about it, where the movie tends to start feeling repetitive and feeling a little dull. But once you get into those final scenes, once you get into the sort of the last third of this film, where it really becomes centered on the beast, especially when the beast shows up in New York, which is a fantastic effect sequence. And then it finally leads to the finale, where the beast is on Coney Island and he has sort of hidden himself away inside the perimeter of a great wooden roller coaster, and then the roller coaster is lit on fire, and the beast is attacked with like a radioactive bullet to try and subdue it and kill it. And while the roller coaster burns all around him, the combination of those elements is just wonderful. You have the stop motion beast combined with a burning model of a Coney Island roller coaster. Just fantastic special effects and a really, really well-directed, well-staged sequence. That whole final third of the movie, once the creature comes ashore and becomes really the center of attention, is just phenomenal. If there is a major problem with the creature itself that I had, it's that it was fantastic on a technical level, but you don't really get a sense of character from the creature. And some of you might say, well, that's a little silly. You know, it's a monster, it's a dinosaur. How could you get any sense of character from it? But I would argue that you do get a sense of character from other stop-motion creations in great stop-motion movies, like the original King Kong, like Mighty Joe Young. And even though it's not a stop-motion thing, it's a guy in a suit, you definitely get a sense of character from Godzilla in the Godzilla movies. And when the beast from 20,000 Fathoms finally meets his fate at the end of the movie, there's not really much of an emotional punch. You realize you've been watching a splendid technical exercise that doesn't really have a lot of emotion attached to it. At least that's how I reacted to the movie. It's technically impressive, but it often falls flat, and it gets kind of dull when it's just the people running around doing things, and that resolution of the conflict with the creature, the ultimate fate of the creature itself, doesn't really pack a wallop. You don't really feel bad for it. You don't really feel relieved that it's been subdued. You don't really feel any kind of emotional release in response to the resolution of the crisis with the beast. And that to me is a problem, and it's something that holds it back for me from being considered in the upper echelon of these types of movies, like I would say a movie like Them deserves to be. But nonetheless, you cannot discount its importance. This was an incredibly influential movie. It was a huge box office success. It led to the production of other movies about giant creatures, mutant animals, sci-fi horror mashups like Them, and it was an influence on even far later films. If you've ever seen the movie from a couple years ago, Cloverfield, which is very similar in many respects to the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and even incorporates elements from the film into it to sort of pay homage and make reference to it. So this is it's a widely admired film, a very influential movie, and justly so. Because again, if you're a Harryhausen fan and you want to see some of his early work when he first sort of handed the reins and allowed to become the master of a production like this and take over the stop motion effects. This is absolutely Harryhausen at its best, and for that and for the influence that it had over its tiny little subgenre of creature features, you really have to check out The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.